The wind carried more than dust that October evening. It brought whispers of change, though Sarah Whitmore couldn't have known it as she guided her mare along the rutted trail back from Silver Creek. The New Mexico territory stretched endless before her, painted in shades of rust and gold by the dying sun. Her basket held precious little from the general store flour, salt, a small tin of coffee she'd hesitated over before purchasing. Money was tight since James died. 2 years now, and the ache still caught her sometimes, sharp as a cactus spine. "Easy, Buttercup," she murmured as the mare snorted nervously. Sarah's hand moved to the old Colt revolver at her hip, a gesture that had become second nature. The desert held many dangers for a woman alone. That's when she saw him. At first, just a dark shape against the red rocks, maybe 100 yards off the trail. Could have been a dead steer or a pile of tumbleweeds, but Buttercup's ears flicked back, and Sarah had learned to trust the mare's instincts. She reined in, squinting through the gathering dusk. The shape moved barely, but enough. Human. Her fingers tightened on the revolver's grip. "Hello?" Her voice cracked the desert silence. No answer came. Sarah dismounted, leading Buttercup closer. Common sense screamed at her to ride on, to mind her own business like any sensible widow would. But something, maybe the way the figure lay so still, maybe just plain stubbornness, pulled her forward. 20 feet away, she stopped. It was a man. That much was clear. Dark skin, long black hair matted with what looked like blood. Native, Apache Navajo. She couldn't tell. His buckskin shirt was torn, revealing a gash along his ribs that still seeped red. "Lord have mercy," she breathed. The man's eyes opened dark as midnight, focused despite the pain. His hand moved slightly, not toward a weapon, but in what might have been surrender. Or perhaps he was simply too weak to do more. Sarah stood frozen. She knew what she should do. Ride to town, tell Sheriff Watson, let the law handle it. That's what James would have done, what any God-fearing citizen would do. The government had been rounding up natives for years now, forcing them onto reservations. This one was probably a runaway. Maybe even one of those warriors they talked about in hushed tones at the mercantile. But those eyes, they held no threat, only a weary acceptance of whatever fate she'd choose for him. "Can you understand me?" she asked. A slight nod. "Are you alone?" Another nod, followed by a grimace of pain. Sarah looked back down the trail. Nobody in sight. She looked at the wounded man again. The blood had pooled beneath him, darkening the sand. Without help, he'd be dead by morning. Coyotes would find him first, then buzzards. "Damnation," she muttered, using language that would have earned her a scolding from her mother. "Can you sit up?" He tried, managing to prop himself on one elbow before his strength gave out. Sarah moved closer, fighting every instinct that told her to run. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd thought, maybe 30 summers, with the kind of face that had seen too much too soon. "I'm going to help you," she heard herself say. "But you try anything, and I'll shoot you dead. Understand?" Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. He nodded once more. Getting him onto Buttercup took every ounce of strength Sarah possessed. The man tried to help but could barely stand. She ended up half-dragging him, her dress soaked with his blood by the time she managed to drape him across the saddle. "There's an old line shack," she said, more to herself than to him. "Quarter-mile from my place. Nobody uses it anymore." The walk back seemed endless. Sarah led Buttercup carefully, one hand steadying the unconscious man, the other ready to draw her gun if needed. Every shadow could be a threat, other natives looking for their companion, or worse, soldiers on patrol. The Whitmore ranch appeared just as full darkness fell. It wasn't much a modest adobe house, a barn, a few corrals. James had dreamed of building it into something grand, but dreams had a way of dying in the desert. Sarah bypassed the main house, heading for the old shack tucked behind a stand of cottonwoods. It had served as temporary shelter while they'd built the adobe. and she'd kept it stocked with basic supplies out of habit. Getting the man inside and onto the narrow cot left her trembling with exhaustion. She lit a kerosene lamp, its yellow glow revealing the extent of his injuries. Besides the gash on his ribs, he had a bullet graze on his shoulder and bruises that spoke of a violent encounter. "What have I done?" she whispered. But she knew the answer. She'd chosen humanity over law, compassion over safety, and now she'd have to live with the consequences. Sarah fetched water from the well, along with the medical supplies she kept for ranch accidents. As she cleaned the wounds, the man stirred, his eyes finding hers in the lamplight. "Tohane," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is that your name?" He nodded weakly. "I'm Sarah." She wrung out the bloodied cloth. "Sarah Whitmore." His eyes closed again, but she thought she saw gratitude there. Working by lamplight, Sarah did what she could. The gash needed stitching, something she'd done for horses but never a human. Her hands shook as she threaded the needle. "This is going to hurt," she warned. Tohane's jaw tightened, but he made no sound as she worked. Only his rapid breathing betrayed his pain. When she finished, sweat beaded both their faces despite the cool night air. Sarah bandaged the wounds with torn strips of clean petticoat, trying not to think about the impropriety of it all. "You need to stay hidden," she said. "There's water here, and I'll bring food. But if anyone finds you—" She didn't need to finish. They both knew what discovery would mean. Sarah gathered the bloody rags, planning to burn them later. At the door, she paused, looking back at the wounded warrior who disrupted her carefully ordered life. "Why?" Tohane asked, the single word carrying the weight of history between their peoples. Sarah considered her answer. Why indeed? Because she was lonely, because she was tired of being afraid, because something in his eyes reminded her that beneath skin color and cultural divide, they were all just human. "Because someone should," she said finally, and stepped out into the night. The walk back to her house had never seemed longer. Every cricket's chirp sounded like an alarm. Every shadow held potential discovery. Sarah forced herself to move normally, to light her kitchen fire and heat the beans she'd planned for supper, though her appetite had fled. Through her window, she could just make out the dark shape of the shack. What had she set in motion? Tomorrow she'd have to ride to town as usual, pretend nothing had changed. She'd have to lie to people who'd known her since she'd arrived as James's bride 5 years ago. A coyote howled in the distance, answered by another. Sarah shivered, though the kitchen was warm. She thought of Tohane lying wounded and alone, trusting a stranger's mercy in a world that had shown him precious little. "Lord, help me," she prayed, not for the first time that night. "And help him too." Outside, the desert wind continued its eternal song, carrying secrets and sand in equal measure. And in a humble shack behind a stand of cottonwoods, 2 worlds had collided with consequences neither could yet imagine. The first 3 days passed in a blur of careful routine. Sarah would rise before dawn, tend to her regular chores, then slip away to the shack with supplies hidden beneath her shawl. Each time she approached, her heart hammered against her ribs, half expecting to find soldiers surrounding the place. But there was only Tohane, growing stronger despite the severity of his wounds. "You heal quickly," she observed on the 4th morning, checking the stitches along his ribs. "My people learn to," he replied, his English careful but clear. "Or we die." Sarah had brought fresh bandages and a pot of rabbit stew. The smell filled the small space as she worked, and she noticed how his nostrils flared with hunger. "When did you last eat properly?" she asked. "Before the soldiers came. 4 days, maybe 5. She ladled stew into a bowl, watching as he ate slowly, with dignity despite his obvious hunger. Everything about him spoke of pride held tight even in desperate circumstances. "Why were they after you?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Tohane set down the bowl, his dark eyes studying her. "They say I stole horses, but the horses were ours, taken when they moved my family to the reservation. I only took back what belonged to us. And your family." A shadow crossed his face. "Gone. Disease took my sister last winter. My mother." He stopped, jaw tightening. "The reservation is a place of slow death. I chose to die free instead." Sarah busied herself with rewrapping bandages, unsure how to respond. She'd heard stories about the reservations cramped, undersupplied, rife with illness, but hearing it from someone who'd lived it was different. "You risk much, helping me," Tohane said quietly. "I know." "Why?" It was the second time he'd asked, and Sarah still didn't have a good answer. "Maybe I'm tired of being scared all the time. Maybe I needed to do something that mattered." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of kindred loneliness. The moment shattered as hoofbeats approached the ranch. Sarah jumped up, peering through a crack in the wall. 3 riders were coming up the main trail. "Stay quiet," she hissed, grabbing the stew pot and bowl. "No matter what you hear." She slipped out, forcing herself to walk casually toward the main house. The riders were closer now, Sheriff Watson's distinctive gray hat visible even at a distance. Her mouth went dry. By the time they reached her porch, Sarah had composed herself, even managed to put on coffee. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore." Watson touched his hat brim. He was a hard man in his 50s, with eyes like chips of flint. "Mind if we come in?" "Of course not, Sheriff." Sarah kept her voice steady. "Coffee's just about ready." The 3 men dismounted Watson and 2 deputies she recognized from town. They tied their horses and followed her inside, their spurs jangling ominously on her wooden floor. "We're looking for a renegade," Watson said without preamble. "Navajo buck, about 30, shot up pretty bad in a scuffle with an army patrol a few days back." Sarah poured coffee with steady hands. "Haven't seen anyone like that." "You sure about that?" Deputy Harris, younger and meaner than Watson, fixed her with a suspicious stare. "You're out here all alone. A man like that might think you're an easy target." "I keep my husband's rifle handy," Sarah replied coolly, "and Buttercup would alert me if strangers came around." Watson sipped his coffee, those flinty eyes never leaving her face. "Thing is, we tracked him to within a couple miles of here before the trail went cold. Thought maybe you'd seen something, heard something." "I'm sorry. Sheriff, I wish I could help." "Do you?" Harris muttered. Watson silenced him with a look. "Mind if we have a look around just to be thorough?" Sarah's heart threatened to burst from her chest, but she managed a calm nod. "Of course, though I don't know what you expect to find." The men searched her barn first, poking through hay bales and checking the loft. Sarah followed, making idle conversation about the weather and her plans for winter. All the while, her mind raced. The shack was hidden by the cottonwoods. But if they decided to search the whole property— "You got any hired help?" Watson asked, emerging from the barn. "Just Miguel. He'll be by tomorrow to help with the heavier work. Old Miguel Herrera. He's a good man." Watson's expression softened slightly. "Your husband trusted him." "Yes, James always spoke highly of him." They moved through her vegetable garden, checked the smokehouse and root cellar. With each step, Sarah felt the noose tightening. Then Harris pointed toward the cottonwoods. "What's back there?" Sarah's throat constricted. "Just an old line shack. We lived there while building the house. It's half falling down now." "Worth a look," Harris said, already walking that direction. "Now, hold on," Watson called. "Mrs. Whitmore's been nothing but cooperative. No need to go traipsing all over her property." But Harris was already halfway there. Sarah could only follow, praying Tohane had heard the horses and hidden himself somehow. The deputy kicked open the shack door, hand on his pistol. Sarah held her breath. Empty. The cot was there, but no sign of Tohain. Even the blood-stained boards had been covered with dirt. "Told you," Watson said. "Waste of time." He turned to Sarah. "Sorry for the trouble. Ma'am, you see anything suspicious, you'll let us know." "Of course, Sheriff." After they left, Sarah forced herself to wait a full hour before returning to the shack. She found Tohain underneath it, pressed into a shallow depression he'd somehow managed to dig despite his injuries. His face was gray with pain and effort. "Help me," he gasped. Getting him back inside took both their strength. Fresh blood seeped through his bandages where the stitches had pulled. "You fool," Sarah said, but her hands were gentle as she cleaned the reopened wounds. "You could have killed yourself." "Better than bringing death to you." His words stopped her cold. She looked at him, really looked. Beyond the warrior exterior, beyond the cultural divide, she saw a man who'd risked further injury to protect her, a stranger who'd shown him kindness. "Don't do that again," she said softly. "Promise me." "I cannot promise, but I will try." That evening, Sarah couldn't settle. She paced her kitchen, started and abandoned a dozen tasks. The close call with Watson had shaken her more than she'd admitted. How long could this continue? How long before someone noticed her strange behavior? Her frequent trips to the shack? She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the sound horses again, but moving quietly this time. Sarah doused her lamp and crept to the window. A lone rider circled her property line. Keeping to the shadows, not Watson, this rider sat his horse differently, moved with predatory purpose. After a few minutes, he disappeared into the darkness. Sarah stayed by the window for hours, James's rifle across her lap, but the rider didn't return. The next morning, Miguel arrived as scheduled. The old Mexican had worked for James since before Sarah arrived, and stayed on after the funeral out of loyalty and perhaps pity for the young widow. "Buenos dias, señora," he greeted, touching his worn hat. "Morning, Miguel." They worked side by side repairing a corral gate, comfortable and familiar routine, but Sarah noticed how Miguel's eyes kept drifting toward the cottonwoods. Finally, as they paused for water, he spoke quietly. "There are tracks around your well. Señora, moccasin tracks." Sarah's hands stilled on her cup. "A man needs water," Miguel continued, studying the horizon. "Especially a hurt man, but others might not understand this." Their eyes met. In Miguel's weathered face, Sarah saw knowledge and a deliberate choice to keep silent. "Thank you, Miguel," she said simply. He nodded. "Your husband, he was a fair man, but sometimes, Señora, fairness and law are not the same thing. My people have known this for a long time." They returned to work, but Sarah felt something had shifted. She wasn't entirely alone in this anymore. That night, she brought Tohain not just food and medicine, but also news of the mysterious rider. He listened intently, his expression darkening. "Someone watches," he said. "Maybe soldiers, maybe others." "Others." "There are men who hunt my people for bounty. The government pays for Apache scalps. They don't always check if the hair came from Apache or Navajo or Mexican." Sarah shuddered. She'd heard such rumors, but hadn't wanted to believe them. "You should go," Tohain said suddenly. "Leave me supplies. But go, visit family somewhere, until I am strong enough to leave." "I don't have family to visit, and even if I did," Sarah shook her head, "I won't abandon you now." "Stubborn woman." "So I've been told." Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, Sarah found herself lingering in the shack that night. They talked carefully at first, then with growing ease. Tohain told her about learning to track from his grandfather, about the sacred mountains of his people. Sarah shared memories of her childhood in Missouri, her journey west as a new bride. "Your husband," Tohain asked carefully, "he was good to you?" "Yes, James was safe, predictable, everything I thought I wanted." Sarah traced patterns in the dusty floor. He died of fever 2 winters ago. The doctor said there was nothing to be done. I am sorry. So am I, but sometimes I wonder if I'm sorrier for his death or for... She stopped, ashamed of the thought. For a life half lived. Tohain finished quietly. I understand this. Their eyes met across the lamplight, and Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of bonds she hadn't realized were there. A coyote's howl broke the moment. Sarah stood quickly, gathering her things. I should go. It's late. But as she reached the door, Tohain called her name. She turned back. Thank you, he said simply, for seeing a man, not just an enemy. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice, and stepped out into the cool night air, walking back to her house. She touched her cheeks and found them wet with tears she couldn't explain. Behind her in the shack, a Navajo warrior watched her go through cracks in the wall, his heart carrying a burden that had nothing to do with his healing wounds. The kerosene lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows across the rough wooden walls of the shack. Sarah had been changing Tohain's bandages, a ritual that had become strangely intimate over the past week. Her fingers worked with practiced efficiency, but tonight something felt different. The wound is healing well, she murmured, trying to ignore how aware she'd become of his warmth, the rise and fall of his breathing. Your hands have magic, Tohain said softly. Sarah's fingers stilled. She looked up to find him watching her with those midnight eyes that seemed to see through all her carefully constructed walls. It's just basic doctoring, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. No. He caught her hand as she moved to pull away. It is more. The touch was gentle, barely there, but it sent lightning through her veins. Sarah knew she should pull back, should maintain the careful distance that kept this arrangement merely charitable. Instead, she found herself frozen, caught in a moment that stretched like pulled taffy. Tohain, she breathed, and his name felt like a prayer on her lips. He lifted her hand slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw. When she didn't, he pressed it to his chest, over his heart. The steady beat thundered against her palm. Do you feel it? He asked in his own language, then repeated in English. How it speaks your name. Sarah's own heart was racing so fast she thought it might escape her chest entirely. We can't. This isn't... What isn't this? His voice held a challenge and a plea all at once. Tell me you feel nothing, and I will never speak of it again. She couldn't. The lie wouldn't form on her lips. These past days, their conversations had become the bright spot in her existence. She found herself rushing through chores to spend more time in the shack, inventing excuses to linger. I feel too much, she admitted. That's the problem. Tohain sat up slowly, wincing only slightly. His free hand came up to cup her face with infinite tenderness. Among my people, we say that the heart knows truths the mind cannot accept. Sarah leaned into his touch despite herself. When was the last time someone had touched her with such reverence? James had been kind but perfunctory. Their marriage bed a matter of duty rather than desire. The world would never accept it, she said. The world has already rejected me. What more can it take? His thumb traced her cheekbone. But you saw me bleeding in the desert and chose mercy. You risk everything to help me. Why? I told you, I don't know. You know. His voice was certain. As I knew when I first saw you, golden in the sunset like a spirit from my grandmother's stories. My body was broken, but my eyes still saw true. Sarah's breath caught. You were nearly unconscious. A man near death sees most clearly, and I saw you, Sarah Whitmore. Not just your face, but your soul calling to mine. The lamp flame guttered in a sudden draft, sending shadows wild across his face. In that moment, he looked otherworldly, ancient and eternal, dangerous and beautiful all at once. I'm afraid, Sarah confessed. Of me. Of myself. of what I want when I look at you." The admission burst from her like water through a dam. I was raised to be proper, to follow rules, to never want anything beyond what was given, but when I'm with you, I feel alive, like I've been sleeping my whole life and only now waking up. Tohain's hand slid from her face to her neck, fingers tangling gently in the hair at her nape. "Then wake up, small bird. Wake up and fly." The kiss was inevitable, as sunrise soft at first, tentative, as if both were afraid the other might vanish. Then Sarah made a sound in her throat, part sob, part surrender, and the careful distance between them collapsed entirely. His lips were warm and sure, tasting of the sage tea she'd brought him earlier. Sarah's hands found his shoulders, careful of his injuries but needing to anchor herself in the storm of sensation. She'd been kissed before, but never like this, never as if she were precious beyond measure, never as if the kiss itself were a conversation between souls. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, Sarah's eyes were wet with tears. "Don't cry," Tohain murmured, catching a tear with his thumb. "I'm not sad. I don't have words for what I am." She laughed shakily. Probably scandalous, definitely improper. The good wives in town would stone me if they knew. "Let them try." There was steel in his voice suddenly, the warrior showing through. "I would not let them harm you. You can barely stand," Sarah pointed out, though his protective fury warmed something deep inside her. I would find a way. They stayed close, foreheads touching, sharing breath and space and the terrible, wonderful knowledge of what had grown between them. "This cannot end well," Sarah said eventually. "Nothing in life ends well. We all die eventually." Tohain pulled back enough to look at her fully. "The question is whether we live first." A sound outside made them both freeze footsteps, trying to be quiet but not quite succeeding. Sarah blew out the lamp instantly, and Tohain pushed her behind him despite his injuries. "Mrs. Whitmore," a voice called softly. "Senora, are you in there?" Sarah's shoulders sagged with relief. "Miguel." "Si, Senora, I need to speak with you. There is trouble." Sarah relit the lamp with shaking hands and opened the door. Miguel stood there, his weathered face grave in the yellow light. "What is it?" she asked. The old man's eyes flicked to Tohain, taking in their closeness, the disturbed air between them. If he drew conclusions, he kept them from his face. "Men in town talk," Miguel said. "That deputy, Harris, he doesn't believe you. He tells everyone you hide something, and there are others, bounty hunters, asking questions." "How do you know this?" Sarah asked. "My nephew works at the saloon. He hears things." Miguel shifted uncomfortably. "Senora, they plan to come back. Not the sheriff, he thinks you are honest, but Harris and others, they will come at night, when the law cannot see." Sarah's blood ran cold. "When?" "Maybe tomorrow, maybe 2 days, soon." Tohain struggled to his feet. "I must go, now, tonight." "You can't," Sarah protested. "You're not strong enough." "I am strong enough to die standing rather than bring danger to her," Tohain said to Miguel, who nodded approvingly. "No!" Sarah's voice rang with sudden authority. "I won't have it, not after—" She stopped, acutely aware of Miguel's presence. But the old man merely said, "The heart chooses strangely sometimes. Senora, my Rosa, she was Apache, her family, my family, they all said it was wrong, but 50 years we had together before the fever took her." He looked at Tohain. "You are Navajo." "Yes, grandfather." Tohain used the term of respect. "My Rosa's people and yours were not always friends. But blood is blood, and love is love." Miguel turned back to Sarah. "There is a place in the canyon lands. My cousin has a small ranch there. Very quiet, very private, if you were to take a trip." "I can't just leave my ranch," Sarah protested. "I will watch it, as I always do when you go to town for supplies. A week, maybe 2, until these hunters move on to easier prey." Sarah looked between the 2 men, one offering escape, the other ready to sacrifice himself for her safety. The proper thing would be to send Tohain away, to pretend none of this had happened. The safe thing would be to distance herself from the danger he represented. But when had she ever chosen safe? "How soon can we leave?" she asked Miguel. Relief flickered across the old man's face. "Tomorrow night would be best. I will draw maps, prepare supplies. You must go quietly, take the old trading paths." After Miguel left, Sarah turned to find Tohain watching her with an unreadable expression. "You would do this?" he asked. "Leave your home, risk everything for you," Sarah finished simply. "Yes." He crossed to her in 2 strides, catching her face in his hands. "You humble me, small bird. No more than you humble me, my warrior." The endearment slipped out unbidden, but Tohain's eyes blazed with something that made her knees weak. "Say it again," he commanded softly. "My warrior," Sarah whispered, and was rewarded with another kiss that made the first seem tame by comparison. This time there was urgency beneath the tenderness, the knowledge of danger approaching lending desperation to their touch. Sarah's hands mapped his face, his shoulders, careful still of his wounds but needing to memorize him by touch. When they parted, she was trembling. "I should go back to the house," she said without conviction. "Yes," Tohain agreed without releasing her. They stood suspended in the lamplight, caught between propriety and desire, danger and safety, the known world and the vast unknown stretching before them. Finally, Sarah stepped back. "Tomorrow night, then, we'll leave together." "Together," he echoed, the word a vow. Sarah made it halfway to the door before turning back. "Tohain, that first night, when I found you, were you really unconscious?" A smile ghosted across his lips. "A warrior learns to be still when his life depends on it, but when you spoke—" He shook his head in wonder. "Your voice called me back from the edge of the spirit world. I knew then that the gods had plans for us. And now I know the gods have a sense of humor, sending me a stubborn white woman with healing hands and a heart like fire." Sarah laughed, despite everything. "And sending me a Navajo warrior who quotes his grandmother and kisses like the world is ending." "Perhaps it is," Tohain said seriously. "The old world, at least. The one that says we cannot be." Sarah considered this, then nodded slowly. "Then let it end. We'll build a better one." She left then, while she still had the strength to go, but all the way back to her house, she felt the phantom pressure of his lips on hers, the warmth of his hands on her skin. Tomorrow night they would run toward what? She didn't know. But for the first time in her life, uncertainty felt like freedom rather than fear. In her kitchen, Sarah began mental preparations for flight, even as her heart prepared for something else entirely. Through her window, the lamp in the shack glowed like a fallen star, and she knew Tohain watched her house with equal longing. One more day of pretense, one more day of being the proper widow Whitmore. Then they would cast off those chains and flee into the desert night, guided by nothing but Miguel's maps and the terrifying, wonderful pull between them. Sarah touched her lips, still feeling the burn of his kiss, and smiled. Let the bounty hunters come. Let the whole town talk. She'd found something worth any risk, any scandal. She'd found home in the last place anyone would look in the arms of a wounded warrior who saw her truly, who woke her from a lifetime of sleeping. Tomorrow night couldn't come fast enough. The night was colder than any October had a right to be in the New Mexico territory. Sarah stood in her bedroom, shivering despite the thick shawl wrapped around her shoulders. But the trembling had little to do with temperature and everything to do with what she was about to do. Through her window, she could see the faint glow from the shack where Tohain waited. They'd planned to leave tomorrow night, but something felt wrong. All day she'd sensed eyes on her, noticed riders in the distance who disappeared when she looked directly at them. Now, past midnight, with sleep eluding her completely. Sarah made a decision that would have shocked the proper woman she'd been just weeks ago. She shed her nightgown and dressed in silence chemise, corset, petticoats, her darkest dress. Then, taking a breath that did nothing to calm her racing heart, she removed everything again. The cold air kissed her bare skin like a blessing or a curse. Wrapping herself in James's old coat, the one that still hung by the door though its owner was 2 years in the ground, Sarah stepped out into the night. The path to the shack had never seemed longer. Every shadow could hide watching eyes. Every sound might herald discovery. But deeper than fear ran a current of inevitability. She'd been moving toward this moment since she first saw Tohain bleeding in the desert sand. At the shack door, she hesitated. The coat was heavy wool, but still let the cold through. She was already shivering violently. But it wasn't really warmth she sought behind this weathered door. Sarah let the coat fall. The desert night embraced her bare skin with icy fingers. For a moment, she stood there vulnerable, exposed, more honest than she'd ever been in her life. Then she raised her hand and knocked softly. "Tohain!" Movement inside. The door opened, and there he stood, wrapped in a blanket, his eyes widening at the sight of her. "I'm cold," she whispered. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, they simply looked at each other. Then Tohain reached out, drew her inside, and wrapped her in the warmth of his blanket and his arms. "Sarah," he breathed against her hair, "what are you doing?" "Choosing," she said simply. "Choosing you. Choosing us. Choosing to live before it's too late." His hands were reverent as they traced her shoulders, her arms, as if unable to believe she was real. "You honor me beyond words." "Then don't use words," Sarah whispered, and pulled his head down to hers. This kiss was different from the others, deeper, hungrier, full of promise and permission. When Tohain pulled back to look at her, his eyes held questions she answered by pressing closer, letting the blanket fall away from them both. "Your wounds," she said belatedly, "are forgotten," he assured her, and proved it by lifting her easily, carrying her to the narrow cot. What followed was a revelation. Sarah had known the marriage bed as duty, as brief discomfort endured for propriety's sake. But this was conversation without words, worship without altar, prayer without pretense. Tohain touched her as if she were sacred, kissed paths across her skin that made her understand why some called it divine. "Look at me," he commanded softly when sensation threatened to carry her away. "See me seeing you." And she did, maintaining that connection even as their bodies joined in the ancient dance. In his eyes, she saw herself transformed, not the proper widow, not the frightened woman, but something wild and free and utterly alive. After, they lay entwined on the too small cot, Sarah's head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. The lamp had burned low, casting more shadow than light. "In my culture," Tohain said quietly, "when a man and woman choose each other this way, they are married in the eyes of the holy people." Sarah traced patterns on his chest. "And in mine. I'm now a fallen woman." "You did not fall. You flew." He tilted her chin up. "Do you regret?" "No," Sarah said without hesitation. "Never." A sound outside made them both tense, horses moving slowly, trying for stealth. "They're here," Sarah breathed. Tohain was already moving, pulling on his buckskins with practiced efficiency despite his healing injuries. "How many?" Sarah peered through a crack in the wall. 4, maybe 5. Her heart sank as she recognized Harris's silhouette. "They're surrounding the shack." "The window," Tohain said urgently. "You can fit through. Run for the house. Bar the door." "I'm not leaving you." "Sarah." No. She was already pulling on her dress with shaking hands. "We face this together or not at all." Before he could argue further, a voice rang out. "We know you're in there. Whitmore. Come out with your red lover, or we'll burn you out." Sarah's blood turned to ice, not from the threat, but from the knowledge in Harris's voice. How long had they been watching? "I'll go out," Tohane said. "While they're focused on me, you run." "Stop trying to sacrifice yourself." Sarah grabbed James's rifle from where she'd left it by the door. "I told you together." Their eyes met in the dim light. Something passed between them, understanding. Acceptance. Love too new to name but too powerful to deny. "Together," Tohane agreed. "Last chance," Harris called. "Come out peaceful-like, and maybe the woman doesn't hang for harboring a fugitive." Sarah checked the rifle's load, hands steady now that the moment had come. "Ready!" Tohane pulled her close for a fierce kiss. "Always." They burst through the door together, Sarah firing high to scatter the horses while Tohane rolled low, coming up with a knife in hand. Chaos erupted shouts, gunfire, the scream of frightened animals. "There!" someone yelled. "The savage has a weapon!" Sarah swung the rifle like a club, catching one man across the jaw. He went down hard, but there were too many, and Tohane was still weak from his injuries. "Drop the weapons," Harris commanded. His pistol trained on Sarah. "Now!" They had no choice. The rifle fell from Sarah's numb fingers. Well, Harris sneered, taking in Sarah's state of undress, her hair wild around her shoulders. "Guess we know what kind of woman you really are. Widow Whitmore. Your husband's barely cold, and here you are, spreading your legs for a savage." "You know nothing about it," Sarah said coldly. "I know enough." Harris's smile was ugly. "Know you're gonna hang for aiding a fugitive. Unless..." His eyes traveled over her body with a leer that made her skin crawl. "Maybe we could work something out," Tohane growled, starting forward, but two men grabbed his arms, holding him back. "That's right, boy, you watch," Harris continued. "Watch what happens to race traders who forget their place." He reached for Sarah, and that's when all hell broke loose. A shot rang out from the darkness. Harris spun, clutching his shoulder. More gunfire followed, and suddenly Miguel was there with two other men, all armed. "I think you should leave, Senor Harris," Miguel said calmly, his rifle never wavering. "Before someone gets seriously hurt." "You can't interfere with a lawful arrest," Harris sputtered. "What arrest? I see only men attacking a woman on her own property in the middle of the night. Very bad, Senor. The kind of thing that makes men disappear in the desert." The standoff stretched taut. 5 against 4 now, with Harris wounded. Sarah held her breath. "Finally," Harris spat in the dirt. "This isn't over. When Watson hears about this..." "Sheriff Watson is a lawful man," Miguel interrupted. "He will want evidence, not midnight raids. You have no evidence. See..." Harris's face twisted with rage, but he was outmaneuvered. "Mount up," he snarled to his men. "We're leaving." As they rode away, Harris turned back. "You can't protect them forever, old man. That savage will hang, and the woman with him if there's any justice." Miguel waited until they were gone before lowering his weapon. "There is little justice in this world. Senor, that's why we must make our own." Sarah's knees nearly buckled with relief. Tohane caught her, pulled her close. "Thank you," she said to Miguel. "But how did you know?" "My nephew at the saloon. He heard them planning, rode hard to warn me." Miguel gestured to his companions, his brother and another cousin. "Family helps family." "We're not your family," Sarah pointed out. "You showed kindness to my Rosa's people," Miguel said simply. "That makes you family." He looked at the shack, at their obvious state of undress, and his weathered face showed no judgment. "But now you must go. Tonight they will return with more men, with paper from a judge. You must be far away before dawn." The next hour passed in a blur. Miguel's family helped them prepare saddling horses, packing supplies, planning routes. Sarah changed into riding clothes, trying not to think about what she was leaving behind. As she took a last look at her house, Tohain appeared beside her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You're losing everything because of me." Sarah turned to face him. "I'm losing a house, some land, things, but I'm gaining." She touched his face. "I can't even measure what I'm gaining." "A hard life, danger, always running." "Freedom," Sarah countered. "Love, you." She smiled despite everything. "Worth any price." They mounted up as the eastern sky began to lighten. Miguel handed Sarah a letter. "For the bank in Santa Fe, it gives me authority to sell your land. Send you the money when you're settled somewhere safe." Sarah's eyes burned with tears. "Miguel, I can never repay." "Then don't try, just live well, be happy, that's payment enough." They rode out together, Sarah and Tohain, into the vast desert that stretched endlessly before them. Behind them, the shack still glowed faintly with lamplight, a beacon of what had been, what they'd chosen, what they'd sacrificed for love. "Are you afraid?" Tohain asked as they picked their way down a narrow trail. Sarah considered. "Yes, terrified, but also—" She searched for words. "Alive, more alive than I've ever been." He reached across the space between their horses, took her hand. "That's how warriors face battle, afraid but alive. You have a warrior's heart, small bird." "I had a good teacher," Sarah said, squeezing his fingers. They rode on as dawn broke across the desert, painting the world in shades of gold and possibility. Somewhere behind them, Harris nursed his wound and his rage. Somewhere ahead lay Mexico. Safety, a new life. But here, now, in this moment suspended between night and day, past and future, there was only Sarah and Tohain, choosing each other with every step their horses took away from the world that said their love was wrong. "No regrets?" Tohain asked as the sun cleared the horizon. Sarah thought of the midnight knock on his door, the fall of the coat, the whispered confession of cold that had led to such heat. She thought of all the proper things she'd never do again, all the improper things she'd discovered in his arms. "No regrets," she said firmly, "only anticipation." And they rode on, into the new day, into their new life, together. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace. Sarah had thought she knew heat, living on her ranch these past years, but riding hard with danger at their backs taught her new definitions of misery. Sweat soaked through her riding dress, and dust caked every inch of exposed skin. "We need to rest the horses," Tohain said, guiding them toward a cluster of rocks that offered meager shade. Sarah dismounted on trembling legs, her body screaming protests after hours in the saddle. She'd ridden before, of course, but never like this, never with such desperate purpose. "How far to the border?" she asked, accepting the canteen Tohain offered. 2 days, maybe 3 if we must hide." He studied the horizon with the intensity of a man whose life had often depended on reading the land. "They will follow." "I know." Sarah tried to keep the fear from her voice. In the clear morning light, the magnitude of what they'd done, what she'd done, hit full force. "Sheriff Watson won't let Harris pursue us officially, but hate needs no badge," Tohain finished, "and Harris has friends who think like him." They rested in silence, sharing dried meat and hard biscuits from Miguel's supplies. Sarah found herself studying Tohain's profile as he kept watch, even exhausted and dust-covered. He moved with a grace that made her heart quicken. "You're staring," he said without turning. "Am I not allowed to look at my husband?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. Tohain turned then, his dark eyes warming. "Is that what I am?" Sarah felt heat in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. "You said, last night, you said in your culture—" "Yes." He moved closer, cupping her face with one calloused hand. "But what does your heart say?" "My heart says you've been my husband since the moment I decided to save you," Sarah admitted. "Everything else was just catching up to what already was." He kissed her then, soft and sweet despite their cracked lips and the danger pressing at their backs. When they parted, Tohain pressed something into her hand, a small piece of turquoise wrapped in silver wire. "It was my mother's," he said. "She gave it to me before the soldiers came. Said to give it to the woman who would share my path." Sarah's throat tightened as she closed her fingers around the precious gift. "I have nothing to give you in return." "You gave me life. You gave me yourself. What greater gifts exist?" Before Sarah could respond, dust appeared on the horizon. Riders, moving fast. "Mount up," Tohain commanded. Already moving. They rode hard, pushing the horses to their limits. The landscape blurred past red rocks, sparse vegetation, endless sky, but the dust cloud behind them grew steadily larger. "There," Tohain pointed to a narrow canyon ahead. "We can lose them in the rocks." They plunged into the canyon's shadows, hooves echoing off stone walls. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes barely wide enough for a single horse. Sarah's knee scraped painfully against jutting rock, tearing her skirt. Behind them, shouts echoed. Their pursuers had reached the canyon mouth. "This way," Tohain hissed, guiding them into an even narrower side passage. They dismounted, leading the horses through spaces that seemed impossibly tight. Sarah's dress caught and tore repeatedly, but she pressed on. The shouts were getting closer. Suddenly, the passage opened into a hidden grove, a tiny oasis fed by an underground spring. Ancient cottonwoods provided shade, and thick grass cushioned their steps. "The horses need water," Tohain said. "We'll make our stand here if we must." As their mounts drank greedily, Sarah checked James's rifle. 3 bullets left. Tohain had his knife and a war club he'd fashioned during their flight. Not much against armed men. "I won't let them take you," she said fiercely. "Nor I you." He touched her face. "If it comes to it. If there's no other way." "Don't." Sarah pressed her fingers to his lips. "We survive together, or—" The sound of horses in the passage cut her off. They took position behind a fallen log, weapons ready. But instead of Harris and his vigilantes, a different group emerged, 3 Mexican traders leading pack mules. They stopped short at the sight of Sarah and Tohain. For a moment, no one moved. Then the lead trader, a grizzled man with kind eyes, spoke in Spanish. Tohain responded haltingly. "What's he saying?" Sarah whispered. "He asks if we're the ones the Americanos seek, the mixed couple who dare to love." Sarah's heart sank. "He'll turn us in for the bounty." But Tohain shook his head slowly. He says his daughter married a Yaqui man. Says love doesn't see color, only souls." The trader spoke again, gesturing urgently. "He offers to hide us in their trade goods. They're bound for Chihuahua. But we must decide now. The Americans are close." Sarah looked at Tohain, seeing her own desperate hope reflected in his eyes. Trust strangers or face their pursuers, not much of a choice. "Yes," she said. "Tell him yes." What followed was organized chaos. The traders quickly rearranged their pack mules, creating hidden spaces among bundles of wool and hides. Sarah found herself pressed against Tohain in a makeshift cave of trade goods, barely able to breathe through the dusty fabric. They'd just gotten settled when Harris's voice rang out. "Hold there, we're looking for fugitives." Sarah pressed her face into Tohain's chest, feeling his heart race to match hers. His arms tightened around her. The lead trader responded in broken English, playing up his accent. "No fugitives, senor. Only poor traders. You want buy good prices." "Don't play dumb with me," Harris snarled. "A white woman and a savage. They came this way." "Ah, say we see them," the trader exclaimed. Sarah's blood froze. "They ride very fast toward the west. Maybe 2 hours ago, very dangerous. That hombre, we hide until they pass." Suspicion dripped from Harris's voice. "You wouldn't lie to me, would you?" "Por qué, why I lie? You want to search? But hurry, they get farther away while we talk." Long moments passed. Sarah could hear Harris's men muttering, horses stamping impatiently. The hiding space felt like a tomb, airless and dark. Finally, Harris spat a curse. "If you're lying, old man, I'll find you." See, you find me on the trade routes like always. Now go catch your fugitives." The sound of hooves faded westward. Still, the traders waited a full 10 minutes before letting Sarah and Tohane emerge. "Gracias," Sarah gasped, filling her lungs with clean air. "Thank you so much." The lead trader smiled sadly. "No one should have to hide their love. You ride with us now, safety in numbers." For the rest of that day and into the night, they traveled with the traders. Sarah dozed fitfully against Tohane's back as they rode, trusting him to keep her in the saddle. The traders shared their food and water freely, asking nothing in return but their story. Around the campfire that night, Sarah found herself telling these strangers things she'd never voiced aloud: her loneliness after James died, the empty perfection of her proper life, the way Tohane had awakened something wild and true in her heart. "You are brave, Senora," the lead trader said. "Braver than soldiers. They fight with guns. You fight with love." "I don't feel brave," Sarah admitted. "I feel terrified most of the time." "Of course, only fools feel no fear. Courage is acting despite the fear." As if to underscore his words, a coyote howled in the distance, but it was no coyote. Tohane tensed, recognizing something in the call. "Apache," he said quietly. "Hunting party, maybe." The traders quickly doused the fire. In the darkness, Sarah could feel the tension ratcheting up. Apache and Mexican traders had a long history of bloody conflict. "Let me talk to them," Tohane said. "Apache and Navajo have fought, but we also trade. They might listen." Before anyone could protest, he melted into the darkness. Sarah waited, every nerve screaming, the rifle heavy in her hands. Voices drifted back Tohane's calm tones and others, sharp with suspicion. The conversation went on forever, or maybe just minutes. Time stretched strangely when death waited in the shadows. Then Tohane returned with 3 Apache warriors. Sarah's finger tensed on the trigger, but he shook his head slightly. "They'll let us pass," he said. "But they want a trade, ammunition for safe passage." The lead trader sighed heavily but nodded. Business was business, even when conducted at knife point in the dark. The Apache melted away as silently as they'd come, and the traders broke camp immediately. No one would sleep now anyway. "You risked your life," Sarah said to Tohane as they rode. "You risk yours every moment you're with me." He replied, "The Apache could have killed me, yes, but your people will kill you just as dead for loving me." It was true, and they both knew it. Yet Sarah felt no regret, only a fierce determination to reach safety, to build a life where their love wasn't a crime. Dawn found them at a river crossing. The Rio Grande stretched before them, brown and sluggish, but beautiful as gold to Sarah's eyes. Mexico lay just beyond. But so did a squad of U.S. Army soldiers, watering their horses on the American side. The lead trader cursed creatively in Spanish. "We wait," he decided. They must leave eventually. But as the sun climbed higher, more dust appeared on the northern horizon. Harris and his vigilantes, following the trader's trail. "We're trapped," Sarah breathed. Tohane's jaws set grimly. "Then we fight." "No." The lead trader looked between them, then at his own men. Some silent communication passed. "You hide again. We handle this." Once more, Sarah and Tohane found themselves buried in trade goods. But this time, Sarah kept the rifle with her, ready to fight their way out if necessary. She could hear Harris arguing with the soldiers, demanding they search the trader's goods. The army sergeant sounded bored, uninterested in civilian disputes. But Harris was persistent, and eventually, Sarah heard the soldiers approaching. "I'll make this quick," the sergeant said. Open the bundles. Sarah's finger found the trigger. Beside her, Tohain shifted, ready to spring. This was it, the moment their flight ended in blood or freedom. But as the first bundles were opened, revealing only wool and hides, a commotion erupted from the river. Apache warriors, the same ones from last night, had appeared on the Mexican side, making threatening gestures at the soldiers. "Form up!" the sergeant barked. "Defensive positions." In the chaos that followed, the traders quickly searched their own remaining bundles, declaring them clear. The soldiers had bigger concerns now than one sergeant's half-hearted inspection. "Mount up and move out," the sergeant ordered. "You too," he added to Harris. "This is army business now." Harris protested furiously, but the soldiers weren't interested. As the two groups pulled back from the suddenly dangerous crossing, the traders seized their chance. They splashed across the Rio Grande at speed, whooping with relief as they reached Mexican soil. The Apache warriors watched them go, then melted back into the landscape, their debt from last night's trade repaid in full. When Sarah and Tohain finally emerged from hiding, they were in Mexico. "We made it," Sarah said, disbelief coloring her voice. "We actually made it." Tohain pulled her close, kissing her deeply as the traders cheered and laughed around them. "The first step only," he reminded her when they parted. "Now we must build that new life." Sarah nodded, fingering the turquoise at her throat. Behind them lay everything she'd known: her home, her respectability, her safe and narrow world. Ahead stretched uncertainty, hardship, the challenge of creating a place where their love could exist openly. She'd never felt more terrified. She'd never felt more free. "Together?" she asked. "Always together," Tohain confirmed, and with the Mexican sun warm on their faces and the Rio Grande at their backs, they rode on toward whatever future they could carve from hope and courage and love that refused to recognize boundaries. The Mexican desert was different from its American cousin, the same harsh beauty, but with an older soul. Sarah had thought their troubles would ease once they crossed the Rio Grande, but she'd underestimated the challenges of being strangers in a strange land. They'd parted ways with the traders at Chihuahua, loaded with advice and directions to a village where mixed couples might find peace. Now, 5 days later, Sarah wondered if they'd ever find it. "Water," she croaked, her throat parched despite careful rationing. Tohain studied the horizon with worried eyes. "Soon, the traders said, there's a spring near red rocks shaped like a cathedral. We should reach it by sunset." But sunset came with no red rocks in sight. Their horses plodded on, heads hanging low. Sarah swayed in the saddle, heat exhaustion making her vision blur. "There!" Tohain pointed to a distant rock formation. "Just a little farther, small bird." The endearment gave Sarah strength to continue. When they finally reached the spring, she nearly fell from Buttercup in her haste to reach the water. "Slowly," Tohain cautioned, but his own control slipped as he knelt beside her, both of them drinking deeply from the small pool. As the sun died, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold, they made camp in the shelter of the rocks. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to build a fire. "Let me," Tohain said gently. "I can do it," she insisted, but the third time the kindling failed to catch. She sat back in frustration. "I'm useless out here. I don't know how to survive like this." "You've survived things most couldn't imagine," Tohain reminded her. "You faced down armed men for me. You left everything behind. You're the strongest person I know." "I don't feel strong. I feel—" Sarah struggled for words. "Lost. Like I'm becoming someone else. And I don't know who that person is." Tohain finished building the fire, then settled beside her. "When my people were forced from our lands, my grandmother told me something. She said identity isn't about where you are or what others call you. It's about who you choose to be in each moment. And who am I choosing to be? A woman who loves without boundaries. A warrior in a different kind of battle." He pulled her close. "My wife. if you'll have me truly, in whatever way we can manage." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing her own exhaustion and determination reflected in his face. "I've already chosen that. Every day I choose it again." They huddled together as the desert night turned cold, sharing body heat and the last of their food. Tomorrow they'd need to hunt or trade for supplies. But tonight there was only the fire, the stars, and each other. "Tell me about your grandmother," Sarah said, "the one who gave you the turquoise." Tohain's voice took on the rhythm of old stories. "She was a medicine woman, keeper of the old ways. When the soldiers came, she refused to leave. Said the land was in her bones. Her bones belonged to the land." "What happened to her?" "They burned her hogan with her inside. She sang her death song as the flames rose." His voice held old pain, but also pride. "She died as she lived on her own terms." Sarah tightened her arms around him. "I'm sorry." "She would have liked you," Tohain said unexpectedly. "She always said the strongest medicine came from mixing things that others said couldn't combine." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other and their single blanket, while coyotes sang lonesome songs to the moon. Sarah woke to Tohain's hand over her mouth, his body tense beside her. She froze, instantly alert. In the dying firelight, she saw what had woken him: figures moving among the rocks, trying to surround them. Bandits. The traders had warned them about desperate men who haunted the desert, preying on travelers. Tohain's knife was already in his hand. Sarah slowly reached for the rifle, grateful she'd kept it close. "Americanos," one of the bandits called in accented English. "We know you're awake. No point in pretending." Sarah counted at least 4 voices, maybe more. Too many to fight. "We're not looking for trouble," she called back. "We have little of value." Harsh laughter echoed off the rocks. "A white woman in the desert always has value. Senora, come out, and maybe we don't hurt your man too bad." Rage flooded Sarah's veins. After everything they'd survived, to be caught by common thieves. "Counteroffer," she said, surprising herself with her steady voice. "You leave now, and I don't put a bullet through the first man who shows himself." "Brave words, but you're outnumbered, and dawn is coming. We can wait." Tohain leaned close, whispering rapidly. Sarah nodded, understanding his plan, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Moving silently, Tohain slipped away into the rocks. Sarah kept talking, holding the bandits' attention. "I've already killed one man who thought I was easy prey," she lied smoothly. "Deputy from Silver Creek. Perhaps you heard about it." Murmurs among the bandits. The story of their flight had spread, growing in the telling. "You're the one who ran off with the savage." A different voice now, curious rather than threatening. "The one who shot her way out of town." Sarah let the exaggeration stand. "The very same. And if you think I went through all that just to be taken by desert rats, you're sadly mistaken." A scream erupted from the rocks, one of the bandits. Discovering Tohain the hard way. Chaos followed shouts, running feet, the sound of fighting. Sarah fired at a muzzle flash, heard a yelp of pain, but more bandits emerged from cover, rushing her position. She got off one more shot before they were on her. Sarah fought with desperate fury, using the rifle as a club, but there were too many. Rough hands seized her, and she smelled unwashed bodies and pulque. "Got her!" someone shouted triumphantly. That's when Tohain returned, moving like death itself through the pre-dawn gloom. His knife flashed, and men screamed. Sarah used the distraction to break free, scrambling for the dropped rifle. The fight was brutal and quick. When it ended, 2 bandits lay still, 2 more groaned from wounds, and the survivors had fled into the desert. Tohain stood swaying, fresh blood on his shirt. Not his own, Sarah hoped desperately. "Are you hurt?" they asked simultaneously, then almost laughed at the absurdity. "Scratches," Tohain said, though Sarah saw him favoring his left side. She checked him anyway, finding a shallow knife wound along his ribs, as she cleaned and bound it, using their precious water. Sarah felt something shift inside her. The woman who'd fainted at the sight of blood back in Silver Creek was gone. In her place stood someone harder, more capable, someone who could survive. "We need to move," Tohane said as the eastern sky began to lighten. "The ones who ran will bring others." They packed quickly, Sarah stripping the dead bandits of anything useful with a practicality that would have horrified her former self. Ammunition, food, even a worn serape that would serve as an extra blanket. As they rode away from the bloody campsite, Sarah looked back once. The bodies looked small against the vast desert, already attracting buzzards. "Does it get easier?" she asked. "The killing?" "No," Tohane said quietly. "And the day it does is the day you lose your soul. But sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes it's the only way to protect what matters." They pushed hard through the morning. Following trails Tohane seemed to read from signs invisible to Sarah. By midday, the horses were stumbling with exhaustion. "There!" Tohane pointed to a cluster of adobe buildings shimmering in the heat. A village. As they approached, Sarah's heart sank. The place looked abandoned, walls crumbling, wells dry. But then a figure emerged from a doorway, an ancient woman, bent nearly double with age. She spoke in rapid Spanish, gesturing for them to follow. Too tired to be suspicious, they did. The old woman led them to a hidden courtyard where water trickled from a protected spring. Horses drank while she studied the strangers with eyes that missed nothing. "Gringos?" she asked Tohane. He responded in Spanish, explaining their situation. The old woman's expression shifted from suspicion to something like pity. "Amor," she said, looking between them. "Love makes fools of us all." She gave them food beans and tortillas that tasted like heaven and treated Tohane's wound with herbs that stung but stopped the bleeding. As she worked, she told them the village's story, abandoned after bandits and drought. Only she remained, too stubborn to leave the home her husband had built. "Like you," she said to Sarah in broken English, "too stubborn to let go of love." That night, they slept in the old woman's home, on actual beds for the first time since leaving Sarah's ranch. The luxury of it made Sarah weep silent tears for all they'd lost, all they'd endured, all that still lay ahead. "Why do you cry?" Tohane asked, holding her in the darkness. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. Nothing. I'm just so tired." "Then rest. I'll keep watch. You're exhausted too." "But you're more important." Sarah rose on one elbow to look at him. "Don't do that. Don't make me more important than you. We survived together. Remember, that means we're equals in this." He was quiet for a long moment. "Among my people, women are sacred. They bring life, hold families together. Men protect that sacredness. And among mine, women are property, delicate flowers to be sheltered." Sarah traced his face in the darkness. "But we're not among your people or mine anymore. We're creating something new, so let's create it as equals. You would change thousands of years of tradition." "We already have. Might as well go all the way." Tohane laughed softly. "My grandmother was right. You are strong medicine. Sarah Whitmore." "Sarah, what if we're married in your tradition? If we're building a new life? Shouldn't I have a new name?" "What would you choose?" Sarah thought about it. "Not Whitmore, that was James's name. My father's name before I married was Caldwell. But that doesn't fit either. I'm not that girl anymore. Among my people, names can be earned, given for deeds or dreams." Tohane was quiet, thinking. "You came to me like a spirit in the night, offering warmth when you were cold yourself. In our language, you would be she who brings fire." "I like that," Sarah said softly. "Though I suppose I need something for official papers." "Time enough to decide. For now, you are my wife, my equal, my fire-bringer. The rest is just words on paper." They made love then, carefully because of his wound, quietly because of their host sleeping nearby. But it was different from their first desperate joining deeper, seasoned by trials survived, sweetened by understanding. Afterward, as Tohane finally slept, Sarah lay awake thinking. The woman who'd left Silver Creek in a proper riding dress was gone. In her place was someone leaner, harder, marked by sun and sand and violence, but also someone freer, more honest, more alive than she'd ever been. She touched the turquoise at her throat, thinking of grandmothers and traditions, of names earned and identities chosen. Tomorrow they would continue south, seeking their promised village. More dangers waited: bandits, soldiers, the simple, harsh reality of desert survival. But tonight, in this crumbling adobe room with her warrior husband beside her and an old woman's blessing over them, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected: hope. She was becoming someone new, someone she didn't fully recognize yet. But for the first time, she was eager to meet who that person would be. The desert winds sang through broken walls, carrying the scent of sage and secrets. And Sarah, she who brings fire, finally slept, dreaming of a home yet to be built and a life yet to be lived. The canyon was a death trap. Sarah realized it the moment they entered walls too high to climb, too narrow for quick maneuvering. But they had no choice. Behind them, dust clouds marked their pursuers' approach. American cavalry, from the look of the organized formations. "How did they find us?" Sarah gasped, urging Buttercup forward. "Someone talked," Tohane replied grimly. "Probably in the last town. Gold loosens tongues." They'd been so careful, traveling at night, avoiding main roads, trusting no one. But 3 weeks in Mexico had taught them that nowhere was truly safe for a mixed couple with prices on their heads. The canyon twisted deeper, shadows swallowing them. Sarah's heart hammered as hoofbeats echoed behind them, multiplied by stone walls until it sounded like an army. "There," Tohane pointed to a narrow cleft. "We go on foot from here." They abandoned the horses, a decision that tore at Sarah's heart. Buttercup had carried her so far, so faithfully. "Go," she whispered, slapping the mare's rump. "Find water, live free." They scrambled up the cleft, rocks tearing at their hands and clothes. Sarah's rifle caught on projections, slowing her down. Behind them, shouts grew closer. "Leave it," Tohane urged. No. The rifle had been James's, had saved their lives more than once. It was all she had left of her old life besides the clothes on her back. They emerged onto a ledge halfway up the canyon wall. Below, uniformed soldiers were examining their abandoned horses. Sarah counted at least a dozen men, well-armed and fresh. "Surrender yourselves," the commanding voice echoed off stone. "By order of the United States Army, you are under arrest." Sarah and Tohane exchanged looks. They both knew what arrest meant: hanging for him, prison, or worse for her. "Keep climbing," Tohane said quietly. But as they moved along the ledge, searching for another route up, soldiers appeared at both ends of the canyon. They'd been outmaneuvered. "I see them," a young soldier pointed. "On the ledge." Gunfire erupted. Sarah pressed herself against the rock face as bullets whined past, chips of stone stinging her face. She returned fire, forcing soldiers to take cover, but her ammunition was running low. "We're trapped," she said. Tohane studied their position with a warrior's eye. "Not yet, but soon." He pulled her close. "Listen carefully. When I give the signal, you run for that overhang. Don't stop, don't look back." "What are you planning?" "Something my grandfather taught me. Sometimes a warrior must make the enemy see what isn't there." Before Sarah could protest, he was moving. Tohane pulled off his shirt, tied it to a stick, and waved it like a flag of surrender. "Don't shoot," he called. "We give up." The firing slowed, stopped. Soldiers began emerging from cover, weapons still raised but no longer shooting. "Throw down your weapons," the commander ordered. First, let the woman climb down safely. Tohane countered. "She's injured, needs help." Sarah understood. She limped convincingly toward the overhang, clutching her side as if wounded. The soldier's attention split between her and Tohane. That's when he made his move. Instead of surrendering, Tohane hurled his knife at the nearest soldier and dove the opposite direction, drawing all eyes and guns toward himself. "Now," he shouted. Sarah ran. Bullets filled the air where she'd been standing. She reached the overhang, found handholds, climbed desperately. Below, Tohane led soldiers on a deadly chase along the narrow ledge, somehow staying ahead of their shots. The overhang led to another cleft, this one opening onto the canyon's rim. Sarah hauled herself up, lungs burning, then turned back. Tohane was pinned down, crouched behind a rock outcrop barely large enough to shelter him. Soldiers were closing in from both sides. Sarah didn't think, she just acted. The rifle kicked against her shoulder as she fired, picking targets carefully. One soldier spun and fell. Another ducked back. It gave Tohane the distraction he needed to move. But more soldiers were climbing toward Sarah's position. "Jump!" Tohane appeared at the cleft's mouth, breathing hard, bleeding from a graze on his shoulder. "The river." Sarah looked where he pointed. Far below the canyon's other side, green water gleamed. It looked impossibly distant. "That's suicide." "So is staying." He grabbed her hand. "Trust me." Soldiers burst onto the rim 20 feet away. There was no time left. Together, they ran for the edge. Together, they leaped into space. The fall lasted forever. Wind tore at Sarah's clothes, her hair. She had time to think this was how she would die, holding the hand of the man she loved, suspended between earth and sky. Then the water hit like a cold fist. Sarah plunged deep, the impact driving all breath from her lungs. Darkness surrounded her. She kicked frantically, not sure which way was up, her heavy skirts dragging her down. Strong arms caught her, pulled her toward light. They broke the surface together, gasping. "Swim," Tohane urged. The current was strong, sweeping them downstream. Bullets struck the water around them, but the distance and movement made them difficult targets. Sarah swam as she never had before, her waterlogged clothes trying to drown her with every stroke. They rounded a bend, and the shooting stopped, but the river had its own dangers. Rapids appeared ahead, white water churning over hidden rocks. "Stay together," Tohane shouted over the roar. They hit the rapids hard. Water filled Sarah's mouth, nose, lungs. Rocks battered her body. Once, she went under and thought she wouldn't come up, but Tohane's hand found hers even in the chaos, pulled her back to air. When the river finally calmed, they dragged themselves onto a sandy bank, collapsing side by side. Sarah coughed up what felt like half the river while Tohane checked her for serious injuries. "Just bruises," she managed. "You—" "The same," he smiled shakily. "My grandfather never mentioned the landing when he taught that trick." Sarah laughed, or tried to. It came out as more coughing, when she could breathe again. She took stock. They'd lost everything: horses, supplies, weapons. Even the turquoise necklace was gone, torn away by the river. "I'm sorry," she said. "Your mother's necklace. It's just a thing. You're what matters." Tohane pulled her close despite their sodden clothes. "We're alive. We're free. Everything else can be replaced." "Free for now. They'll keep coming. Then we keep running. Mexico is large. The world is larger." As if to underscore the point, voices drifted from upstream. The soldiers had found a way down. They forced themselves to move, following the river south, their clothes dried in the desert sun, stiff with mineral deposits. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, but they kept walking, supporting each other when strength failed. Near sunset, they smelled smoke. Tohane scouted ahead, returning with a cautious smile. Mexican traders, the same ones who helped us before. It seemed impossible, but there they were, the grizzled leader and his family, making camp by the river. The old man's eyes widened when he recognized the bedraggled couple. Santos preserve us. We heard you were dead, killed by soldiers at Eagle Canyon. Nearly, Sarah admitted as they were welcomed into the camp. Given food and blankets, the traders shared news as they ate. The American military was putting pressure on Mexican authorities to return the fugitives. Bounty hunters roamed freely. Even some Mexican officials were being bribed to watch for the notorious couple. You need to disappear completely, the leader advised. Change names, change appearance, become different people. That night, by firelight, Sarah cut her long hair short with a borrowed knife. The golden locks that had been her one vanity fell away, leaving her feeling strangely light. One of the trader's wives showed her how to dye what remained with plant extracts, turning gold to dark brown. Tohane shaved his head except for a single long lock, styling himself after tribes from farther south, with different clothes and dirt carefully applied. They looked like a dozen other poor mixed couples scraping by on the frontier. I don't recognize us, Sarah said, studying their reflection in the river. Good, that's the point. Tohane touched her shorn head gently. Do you mourn it? The hair, no. Sarah considered. I mourn simplicity. I suppose the belief that right and wrong were clear, that following my heart would be enough. Is it not? It's everything, but it's also, she struggled for words. Harder than I imagined. Most things worth doing are, he kissed her forehead. Would you go back if you could? Sarah thought of her ranch, her respectable life, the safety of following rules. Then she looked at Tohane, scarred, weathered, transformed by their trials, but still the man whose eyes had called to her soul. Never, she said firmly. Forward is the only direction that interests me now. The traders gifted them an old mule and basic supplies. More importantly, they provided directions to a mining settlement deep in the Sierra Madre, where questions weren't asked if a man could work. My cousin runs a supply store there, the leader explained. Tell him I sent you. He'll help you get established. They parted at dawn. The traders heading east, while Sarah and Tohane turned west toward the mountains. The mule was stubborn but sure-footed, carrying their meager possessions without complaint. As they climbed into the foothills, Sarah looked back one last time at the desert stretching endlessly behind them. Somewhere out there, soldiers still searched. Harris still nursed his hatred. The world they'd fled still insisted their love was wrong. But ahead rose mountains touched with morning gold, promising hidden valleys and new chances. Sarah faced forward, toward the unknown, toward hope. What names shall we use? She asked as they rode. In this mining town, Tohane considered. I could be Juan, common enough. And you? Maria. Sarah tested the name. No, too obvious. She thought of the old woman who'd sheltered them, the trader's wife who'd cut her hair, all the women who'd helped along the way. Rosa, I'll be Rosa. Rosa and Juan, a miner and his wife. Simple people living simple lives. Nothing about us is simple, Sarah laughed. No, Tohane agreed. But we can pretend. We've gotten good at that. They rode on as the sun climbed higher. Two people transformed by love and loss, shaped by trial into something harder but not bitter, scarred but not broken. Behind them lay the bones of who they'd been. Ahead waited whoever they would become. The mule plodded steadily upward, and Sarah, now Rosa, let herself hope that somewhere in these ancient mountains they might find not just hiding but home, a place to stop running. A place to plant the seeds of the life they'd risked everything to claim. For now, though, there was only the trail, the man she'd loved beside her, and the next bend in the path. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The village of San Miguel del Monte clung to the mountainside like a stubborn dream. Adobe buildings terraced up the slope, connected by winding paths worn smooth by generations of feet. Mining camps could be rough places, but this one had the feel of permanence, of community carved from stone and sweat. Sarah Rosa now stood at the window of their small house, watching the sun paint the valley below in shades of gold and shadow. 6 months they'd been here. 6 months of pretending to be Juan and Rosa Morales. Simple folks seeking simple work. "You're up early," Tohain said from their bed, his voice still rough with sleep. "The baby was restless," Sarah replied, hand moving unconsciously to her belly where new life grew. The discovery of her pregnancy had been both joy and terror. A child would root them here, make running harder if their past caught up. But it also felt like defiance creating life in the face of those who'd rather see them dead. Tohain rose, wrapped his arms around her from behind, hands joining hers over the small swell. "Our child will be born free," he murmured. "That's worth any risk." A knock interrupted the moment. Sarah tensed, but Tohain squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. It was just Padre Francisco, the elderly priest who'd become their unlikely protector. "Buenos dias," the priest wheezed, age heavy in his movements but eyes still sharp. "I bring news from the capital." They served him coffee, real coffee, a luxury Sarah had learned to appreciate again. The padre sipped slowly before speaking. "The American government has officially closed your case. The wanted notices are being withdrawn." Sarah's cup rattled against its saucer. "What? Why?" "Politics. Child. There's talk of war between the states. Bigger concerns than one runaway couple." The priest's eyes twinkled. "Also, a certain Miguel Herrera has been most persistent with authorities, presenting evidence that the charges against young Tohain here were false." "Miguel?" Sarah breathed. Even from afar, the old man protected them. "There's more," Padre Francisco continued. "He sold your land as you instructed. The money waits in a bank in Santa Fe under the name Rosa Morales." Tears blurred Sarah's vision. They had resources now. Options. A future that didn't depend on Tohain breaking his back in the copper mines. "We could go back," Tohain said carefully. "If you wanted. Start fresh somewhere in the territories." Sarah considered it. Return to America, where their marriage would be illegal in many states, where their mixed child would face constant prejudice. She looked around their simple home, the bright woven blankets, the herbs drying from the rafters, the cradle Tohain was carving in the evenings. "No," she said firmly. "This is home now. This is where our story continues." Padre Francisco smiled approvingly. "Wise choice. Which brings me to my other purpose. It's time we made your union official in the eyes of God and Mexican law. A proper wedding. Yes." They'd resisted before, wary of documents that might expose them. But now, with the threat lifted and a child coming, it felt right. The ceremony took place 3 days later in the village's small church. Sarah wore a borrowed dress embroidered with bright flowers. Tohain dressed in the style of local vaqueros, handsome and dignified. Half the village attended, having taken the quiet couple into their hearts. As Padre Francisco spoke the ancient words in Latin and Spanish, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that first night when she'd found Tohain bleeding in the desert. Through danger and flight, loss and discovery, they'd been forging something precious from desperate circumstances. "Los declaro marido y mujer," the padre pronounced. "I declare you husband and wife." They kissed to the cheers of the congregation, and Sarah tasted salt tears of joy this time, not sorrow. The celebration lasted well into the night. Music filled the plaza, guitars and violins weaving melodies that spoke of love and longing. Sarah danced until her feet hurt, passed from partner to partner while Tohain watched with amused affection. "You're happy," he observed when she finally collapsed beside him, breathless and laughing. "Completely." she confirmed, terrifyingly, wonderfully happy. As if in response, the baby kicked the first movement strong enough to feel. Sarah gasped, grabbed Tohane's hand, pressed it to the spot. His eyes widened as he felt it too. Strong already, he murmured, like the mother. And the father, Sarah added, stubborn enough to survive anything. The months passed in a rhythm of simple days. Tohane worked the mines, but also began training horses, a skill that earned respect and extra income. Sarah established herself as a midwife and healer, learning from the village women while teaching them what she knew of American medicine. When her time came, it was the women she'd helped who surrounded her, offering comfort and strength. The labor was long, difficult, but Sarah had endured worse. She thought of that cold night at the shack door, of choosing love over safety, and found strength in the memory. Their daughter arrived with the dawn bronze-skinned and blue-eyed, a perfect blend of two worlds. They named her Hope, though the village knew her as Esperanza. She's beautiful, Tohane whispered, cradling the tiny form with infinite gentleness. She's ours, Sarah corrected. That makes her miraculous. News traveled slowly in the mountains, but eventually word came of the American war Padre Francisco had mentioned. North against South, tearing the country apart over questions of freedom and human dignity. Sarah felt the irony deeply. She'd fled a nation that wouldn't accept her love, only to hear it was destroying itself over related principles. Perhaps change will come from it, she mused one evening, nursing Esperanza while Tohane worked on his ledgers. He'd started a small freight business, using his knowledge of desert routes to guide supply trains. Change always comes, he agreed. The question is whether people are ready for it. Sarah thought of their daughter, who would grow up speaking 3 languages, moving easily between worlds that had seemed impossibly divided just years before. She'll be ready. We'll make sure of it. Their second child came 2 years later, a son they named Samuel, after Sarah's father. He had his mother's golden hair and his father's quiet strength. The village celebrated another mixed blessing, another bridge between peoples. Life wasn't without challenges. There were those who looked askance at their mixed family, whispered about propriety and natural order. But for every harsh word, there were dozen kindnesses, neighbors who helped with harvest, friends who stood as godparents to their children, the steady acceptance of a community that judged more by deeds than bloodlines. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Tohane surprised Sarah with a gift. Not jewelry, they lived simply still, but a deed to a small ranch in the valley below the village. For the horses, he explained, and for our children to have land of their own. Sarah threw her arms around him, laughing and crying at once. You wonderful, impossible man! How did you manage it? Saved every peso, traded favors, called in debts. He pulled back to look at her. You gave up your land for me. It seemed only fair to give some back. They moved the following spring, building a modest adobe house with their own hands and the help of friends. Sarah planted a garden, coaxing life from the mountain soil. Tohane filled the corrals with horses, mustangs he gentled with patience rather than force. Esperanza and Samuel ran wild through it all, brown and golden in the sun, chattering in the polyglot mixture that was their birthright, watching them. Sarah often thought of the cold woman she'd been, alone in her proper widow's weeds. That woman would never have imagined this life, dirty hands and sun-weathered skin, children who looked like the future, a love that had demanded everything and given back tenfold. Any regrets? Tohane asked one evening. They sat on their porch, watching sunset paint the mountains while their children played in the yard. Sarah considered. I regret the pain we caused others, the danger we brought to people like Miguel, the lives lost along the way. She reached for his hand. But I don't regret choosing you, not for a single moment. Even when you had to whisper, I'm cold at my door, there was gentle teasing in his voice, but also understanding of what that moment had cost and created. Especially then, Sarah said firmly, That was when I finally chose to be warm, as if summoned by their words. Esperanza came running, Samuel toddling behind. They climbed into their parents' laps, dusty and perfect and loved beyond measure. "Tell us the story," Esperanza demanded. "About how you met." It had become a family tradition, this telling. Sarah and Tohane took turns, weaving truth and legend into something their children could be proud of. A story of two people from different worlds who chose love over law, courage over comfort, a future together over a safe life apart. "Once upon a time," Sarah began, "your mama found your papa hurt in the desert." The children listened with rapt attention, though they knew every word. And as the stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their flight across the desert, Sarah marveled at the journey. From widow to wife, from proper lady to frontier woman, from cold to warm, from alone to surrounded by love. "And they lived happily ever after?" Samuel asked sleepily when the tale wound down. Sarah and Tohane exchanged glances over their children's heads, seeing in each other all the trials survived and joys discovered. "They lived," Tohane said simply, fully and freely, "and that, my son, is the greatest happiness of all." As they carried the sleeping children inside, Sarah paused at the threshold. This adobe house, built by their own hands, filled with laughter and tears and everyday miracles, this was what they'd been seeking all along. Not just escape from those who would keep them apart, but a place to build something new. Home, family. A love that had transformed them both and created a future where their children could walk between worlds with confidence and grace. Sarah, once widow, once fugitive, now wife and mother and keeper of 1,000 small joys, stepped inside and closed the door on the cooling night. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. It always did. But tonight there was peace, there was love, and there was the quiet certainty that every risk had been worth taking. In the bedroom, as they settled the children and prepared for sleep themselves, Tohane pulled her close one more time. "Thank you," he whispered, "for being cold that night, for being brave enough to seek warmth." "Thank you," she whispered back, "for being worth the journey." Outside, the desert wind sang its eternal song, but inside, all was warmth and belonging. The woman who had once stood naked and shivering at a warrior's door had found her way home at last. And home, it turned out, was not a place but a choice, renewed each day, to face the world together. Not anymore, she thought, echoing words from long ago. Not cold anymore, not alone anymore, not afraid anymore. Just alive, fully and completely alive. In the life they'd carved from hope and courage and a love that refused to recognize the boundaries others would impose. It was, as Tohane had said, the greatest happiness of all. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to hear where you're enjoying this tale. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts about Sarah and Tohane's journey. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Wild West Tales for more tales of love and adventure from the American frontier. Don't forget to like this video and hit the hype button to help more people discover these stories of courage and forbidden love in the Old West.